The nursery is gold at this hour, and everything in it looks like a promise kept. It is late in the afternoon in the winter of 1888, in a tall stucco house off Eaton Square in Belgravia, and the fire in the small grate has been fed until it throws its light clear across the room, up the papered walls, over the white iron cot with its lace hangings, along the flank of a rocking horse standing dapple grey and patient in the corner. The wallpaper is the colour that every fashionable house in London wants that season, a deep, saturated, almost jewel-toned green, printed with a pattern of trailing leaves that catches the firelight and seems to move. A nursemaid kneels at the low fireguard, coaxing a coal back into place with the tongs. In the cot, an infant girl of 5 months sleeps with one fist curled beside her ear. In the middle of the room, a boy of 3 stands very still, while a woman in a plain dark dress buttons the last button of his good jacket, smooths his collar, and turns him gently by the shoulders to face the door, the way a jeweller turns a piece to catch the light before it goes into the window. Everything about the room has been arranged to be seen. The rocking horse has never lost a hair from its mane. The lace at the cot is starched into small perfect points. The green paper glows the way only new, expensive paper glows, unfaded, unfamiliar with sunlight, chosen from a pattern book by a mother who wanted her children's room to look like something out of a magazine. And it does. Within the hour, this same boy will be led downstairs by the hand, delivered to a drawing room where his mother sits with her needlework and his father reads the evening paper by the window. And for perhaps 60 careful minutes, he will be their son in the fullest sense the culture permits. Patted, admired, asked a question or two, kissed on the crown of his head, and then returned upstairs to the room with the green walls, the same room he has spent nearly every other hour of his short life inside. It is a beautiful picture. It was meant to be. The Victorian nursery, especially the nursery of a family with money enough to keep one, was built as a kind of quiet exhibit, proof that a household could produce children who were clean, biddable, decorative, and safely out of the way. Wallpaper this vivid did not come cheap. A rocking horse like that one cost more than a housemaid earned in a month. Every detail in this room, from the lace to the leaf pattern climbing the walls, was chosen to say something about the family who paid for it. It said that they were modern, that they were prosperous, that their children wanted for nothing, and beneath all of that lace and paint and firelight, in the same air the infant is breathing as she sleeps, in the same walls the boy has touched every day of his life, in the very syrup a tired nursemaid might spoon into a crying mouth at 2 a.m, there is a story far more complicated than any of it lets on. This nursery, built to be the safest room in the house, the room furthest from disease and dirt and the working world outside, was in many documented cases the most dangerous room a wealthy Victorian child would ever occupy. Not because anyone in it meant harm. Because nobody yet understood what was in the paint, or the paper, or the bottle, or the spoon. This is the year 1888, and Britain has spent half a century falling in love with a colour and a set of habits that its own chemists, when a few of them finally spoke plainly, would call a slow domestic poisoning. Every family in every stratum of that society is navigating physical dangers inside their own homes that the culture has not yet agreed to name, let alone discuss, and the nursery, precisely because it was treated as sacred and separate, absorbed more of that danger than almost any other room. This is a story about what was actually inside the wallpaper, the toys, the medicine cabinet, and the feeding bottle of a wealthy Victorian childhood. It is not a polite story. It is a true one, built from coroner's reports, chemists' testimony, physicians' case notes, and the diaries of the women who were paid to raise other people's children, and who, in the process, often paid with their own health. Before we go further, if this kind of honest, unhurried history is the kind you value, if you would rather sit with the real version of the past than the postcard version, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep doing the research this era deserves. And if a detail in tonight's story catches you, tell me in the comments which historical era unsettles you the most. I read every one. We will look at the wallpaper first, because it is the most visible offender and the one that took chemists and doctors the longest to admit to themselves. Then the toys a child was given to chew and hold. Then the medicine a nursemaid reached for in the dark. Then the bottle a baby was fed from, and the strange, rigid schedule of affection that governed how often a child was allowed to be touched by its own parents. And running through every one of these rooms and habits, we will follow one woman whose job it was to manage all of it alone through the night, for a wage of perhaps £18 a year. Let us begin where every wealthy Victorian nursery began each morning and ended each night, with the woman who was never in the portrait and the children whose whole world she was. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Agnes Coombe, and in the January of 1888 she has been the head nurse of the Ashworth household for a little under 4 years. She is 32 years old, unmarried, the daughter of a Norfolk tenant farmer, and she came into service at 15 as an under-housemaid before working her way, slowly and by reputation, into the nursery, which is considered a step up, cleaner work, better wages, a small room of her own beside the children instead of a shared attic bed. She stands perhaps 5 feet and 3 inches, has the reddened, chapped hands of a woman who washes linen and small bodies in cold water a dozen times a day, and carries herself with the upright, contained posture of someone who has learned that a nurse who looks flustered loses the confidence of the mistress of the house. Agnes's official title is nurse, not nanny, a word that will not come into common use for another generation yet, and beneath her she has one nursemaid, a girl named Polly Rudd, who is 15 and earns perhaps £8 a year plus her keep. Between the two of them, Agnes and Polly are responsible for every hour of Teddy Ashworth's and baby Cecily's lives that their parents are not personally occupying, which is to say nearly all of them. Agnes dresses the children, feeds them, bathes them, teaches Teddy his letters and his prayers, disciplines him when he is willful, sits up through the nights when Cecily cries, and manages the nursery's small, self-contained economy of linen, coal and food ordered up from the kitchen 3 floors below by a bell pull and a written note. What the portrait of a Victorian nursery never shows is what this work does to the body doing it. Agnes has chronic pain in her lower back from lifting a increasingly heavy 3-year-old dozens of times a day. She has not had an uninterrupted night's sleep in longer than she can remember, since even on the calmest nights she wakes at intervals from long habit, listening for the particular quality of silence that means a sleeping child, and the particular quality that means trouble. She has, in the last several months, developed headaches she does not mention to anyone, a persistent dull ache behind the eyes that she attributes to tiredness and the strain of close needlework by lamplight. She keeps this complaint, like most of her complaints, entirely to herself, because a nurse who is unwell is a nurse who might be replaced, and Agnes has seen women twice her age turned out of a household with a week's wages and no character reference over far smaller failings than illness. There is one small, private vanity Agnes allows herself. On her single afternoon off each fortnight, she walks to a stationer's shop on the King's Road and buys, when she can spare the penny, a single sheet of good writing paper, on which she writes to her mother in Norfolk in a hand she has practiced to be as fine and looping as any lady's. It is the one part of her week that belongs entirely to her, and she guards it fiercely. Tonight, as on every night, Agnes will settle Teddy and Cecily into the nursery that their mother chose to be the prettiest room in the house, latch the fireguard, check the window sash, and lie down in the small bed beside the cot to listen, as she does every night, for the particular silence that means all is well. She has no way of knowing that the room itself, the very wallpaper glowing so handsomely in the firelight, is one of the reasons her children sleep so poorly, and that the syrup she gives them for their coughs is not medicine in any sense a modern mother would recognize. Nobody has told her. In 1888, almost nobody in England has been told, plainly and without qualification, what these rooms are actually doing to the small bodies inside them. If you picture a Victorian nursery wallpaper, you probably picture something soft. A pale sprig pattern, perhaps, or a gentle stripe. The kind of paper a modern eye associates with nostalgia and safety. The visual shorthand for a vanished, more innocent domesticity. That picture is almost entirely wrong. And it is wrong in a way that matters. The single most fashionable, most sought-after wallpaper colour of the middle and late Victorian decades was not a soft pastel at all. It was an intense, saturated, almost electric green. A colour so vivid that historians who study period pigments still find it startling under modern light. And that green, more often than any homeowner of the era wanted to know, was made with arsenic. The colour had a name, or rather two names, depending on the exact chemical recipe. The earlier version, developed by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele in 1775, was copper arsenite, sold commercially as Scheele's green. A later, even more stable and more vivid variant, copper aceto arsenite, was marketed as Paris green or emerald green. Both were, by weight, a very large proportion of pure arsenic compound bound into a pigment, and both produced a colour that no other dye of the period could match for brilliance and permanence. Manufacturers loved it because it did not fade in sunlight the way vegetable dyes did. Consumers loved it because it looked expensive, modern and richly natural, the deep green of a well-kept garden brought indoors. By the middle of the century, one printer's estimate suggested that something in the range of 100 million square yards of arsenical green wallpaper had been sold and hung across Britain, and it was not confined to any one type of room. It papered dining rooms, drawing rooms, staircases, and with particular popularity because green was considered a soothing, natural, healthful colour for young eyes, nurseries. The mechanism of harm was not, at first, obvious. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why so many intelligent, careful people missed it for so long. Arsenical wallpaper does not poison a room the way a spilled chemical poisons a room. It does it slowly, through the paper's own aging and through the damp that was a permanent fact of English domestic life before central heating and modern damp proofing. Certain moulds, when they grow on damp arsenical wallpaper paste, can metabolize the arsenic compound into a gaseous form, trimethylarsine, which has a faint smell some contemporaries compared to mice. More commonly and more simply, the pigment itself flaked. As the paper aged, as children pressed sticky hands against it, as coal smoke and candle soot settled into its surface and were brushed or rubbed away, fine particles of arsenical dust worked loose into the air of the room and settled onto every surface in it, including the bedding, the toys, and the lungs of anyone breathing there for hours at a stretch. A nursery, more than almost any other room in the house, guaranteed exactly that kind of prolonged, close exposure. A dining room was occupied for an hour at a meal. A nursery was occupied by an infant in a cot pushed directly against a papered wall for 16 or 18 hours a day. The first widely reported case that forced the medical profession to take the danger seriously came out of the Limehouse district of London in 1862, when 3 children in one family died within a short span of each other, each presenting with symptoms that closely resembled diphtheria, a swollen, constricted throat, difficulty breathing, a creeping general decline. It was only when a 4th child in the same house began to sicken, and a family friend who happened to be medically trained noticed the vivid green paper in the children's bedroom, that anyone thought to test the walls rather than the children. The paper tested strongly positive for arsenic. Around the same period, the eminent surgeon Robert Brudenell Carter, a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, wrote that he believed 2 of his own children had died as a result of arsenical wallpaper in their nursery, a case history a surgeon of his standing did not publish lightly. What followed was not the swift, sensible removal of arsenic from every home in Britain. It was nearly 2 decades of argument, denial, and slow, grinding scientific persuasion. Wallpaper manufacturers had enormous commercial reasons to insist the danger was invented or exaggerated, and one of the loudest and most respected voices defending arsenical green was William Morris, the designer whose firm produced some of the most celebrated wallpapers of the age, and who personally owned a controlling interest in a mine that produced arsenic ore. Morris argued, in print, that the medical alarm over arsenical wallpaper was a form of hysteria, that his papers were perfectly safe, and that the doctors raising concerns did not understand chemistry. It is one of the more uncomfortable footnotes in design history, documented by historians including Lucinda Hawksley, whose research into the arsenic wallpaper scandal draws directly on the period's chemical testimony and correspondence. That a man whose name is now synonymous with tasteful, wholesome Victorian interiors spent years publicly dismissing a danger his own family's fortune depended on denying. For Agnes, none of this argument exists yet as a settled fact. What exists is a nursery with walls the colour of the inside of a leaf, chosen by Mrs. Ashworth from a pattern book precisely because green was thought restful for a child's eyes, and because the paper had cost, by Agnes's private estimate from having once glimpsed the invoice, nearly 4 shillings a roll, a price that told her plainly this was not paper anyone intended to replace soon. Agnes notices things a mistress does not. She notices that where Teddy's small palm has pressed against the wall beside his bed each night, there is now a faint pale smudge in the pattern. The colour rubbed thinner there than anywhere else in the room. She notices that a fine, almost invisible dust settles on the top rail of Cecily's cot within a day or two of dusting. Dust she has always attributed to London's soot from the chimneys, and which she wipes away each morning without a second thought, her bare hand moving in the same motion over the same few inches of wall an untold number of times each week. She notices, too, though she has no word yet for the connection, that both children have coughed more since the room was repapered the previous spring, and that her own headaches, the ones she keeps to herself, began not long after. The broader context here is not simply a story about one bad colour choice. It reflects something historians of the period, including Judith Flanders in her research on domestic Victorian life, describe as a persistent gap between the era's genuine appetite for scientific progress and the slow, contested, often commercially resisted process by which any specific danger was actually proven and acted upon. Britain in the 1860s and 1870s had chemists capable of testing a wallpaper for arsenic content in an afternoon. What it did not have was a legal framework requiring anyone to do so, or to warn a buyer of the result. The Arsenic Act of 1851 had regulated the sale of arsenic as a poison in its raw form, requiring it to be dyed and recorded at point of sale, largely in response to a wave of poisoning cases and accidental deaths. But it said nothing about arsenic bound into a pigment and sold as home decoration. It would take until the very end of the century, well after the events of this story, for arsenical wallpaper to fall out of fashion, driven less by legislation than by a slow shift in public taste and a mounting, undeniable weight of medical case reports that manufacturers could no longer wave away. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that the colour chosen, again and again, specifically for children's rooms, for its calming, natural, healthful associations, was the same colour quietly implicated in case after case of unexplained childhood illness. Green was not a strange or transgressive choice for a Victorian nursery. It was the obvious, tasteful, responsible one. Agnes was not careless in accepting Mrs. Ashworth's decision. She had no reason on earth to question it, and neither, for many years, did anyone else. Which brings us to the question no physician of the period was equipped to ask correctly, because the diagnostic categories available to them simply did not include it. When a Victorian infant sickened slowly, when it vomited more than seemed usual, when it grew fretful and would not settle, when its appetite fell away and its limbs seemed to thin even as its belly stayed round, the reflexive explanation offered by nearly every family doctor, every manual, every experienced grandmother in the house was teething. It is difficult to overstate how much medical and domestic weight rested on that single word in the 19th century. Teething was blamed for fevers, for convulsions, for diarrhea, for skin rashes, for sleeplessness, for a general failure to thrive that might in fact stretch across many months, far longer than any tooth takes to arrive. It was a diagnosis that explained everything and investigated nothing. And it was for a chronically arsenic-exposed infant sleeping against a papered wall night after night, a dangerously convenient piece of medical folk wisdom. The actual physiological picture, reconstructed by later toxicologists and historians of medicine, including James Horton, whose research into the period's near-total saturation with arsenic compounds catalogues case after case of exactly this pattern, looks considerably more specific than teething. Chronic low-dose arsenic exposure in infants produces gastrointestinal irritation, vomiting, watery stool, loss of appetite, and over time, a wasting appearance as the body fails to absorb nutrients properly. It can produce skin eruptions and an unusual pallor. In more severe or prolonged cases, it affects the nervous system, causing irritability, lethargy alternating with restlessness, and in the worst instances, convulsions. To a physician trained in the 1850s or 1860s, working without any laboratory test he could reasonably order for a private patient, without any established link in his own training between decorative pigment and disease, and without any reason to suspect the very walls of a well-appointed nursery, these symptoms did not point anywhere in particular. They looked, to use the era's own vocabulary, like a delicate constitution. They looked like a difficult teething. They looked, tragically often, like nothing that required action beyond patience and a stronger cordial to settle the child's stomach, which, as later chapters in this story will show, frequently made matters considerably worse rather than better. Correspondence published in The Lancet and the British Medical Journal through the 1870s and 1880s shows a small but growing number of physicians beginning to connect the dots, generally after encountering a case dramatic enough to force the question. A family with several sickly children in one papered room. A servant who fell ill only while employed in a particular house. A child who improved markedly during a stay at the seaside and relapsed within weeks of returning home. The physician William Squire was among those who wrote specifically about the presence of arsenic in nursery wallpaper as a suspected cause of chronic childhood illness, describing cases in which children's health improved once the offending paper was stripped from the walls, a kind of accidental clinical trial performed one household at a time, with no controls, no statistics, and no way to prove causation beyond the physician's own accumulated professional judgment. It was not a metaphor when these doctors used the word poisoning. It was their literal, considered diagnosis, arrived at slowly and against considerable social and commercial resistance, that a child's own bedroom was killing them by degrees. What made the situation still crueler is that the child was rarely the only one being poisoned. The adult who spent the most consecutive hours in that same nursery air, who slept in the small bed pushed against the same papered wall, who dusted the same skirting boards and dressed the same cot each morning with her bare hands, was the nurse. Agnes has, by the winter of 1888, spent nearly 4 years of her life in rooms papered exactly this colour, in this house and in the 2 households she worked in before it, because the fashion has been consistent across her entire career in service. Her headaches, which she has attributed for months to eye strain from needlework by lamplight, sit alongside a persistent, low-grade nausea she has likewise explained away, telling herself it must be something disagreeing with her at supper. She has noticed her own skin has grown drier and more prone to small cracks at the knuckles than she remembers it being even a few winters ago. A change she attributes, not unreasonably, to the cold water she washes in 12 times daily. She has no reason to connect any of this to the walls around her, and there is no doctor in her life whose job it is to ask. This is one of the most striking and under-discussed features of the whole arsenical wallpaper era. The servant who lived inside the poisoned room around the clock was frequently exposed more heavily and for longer than the children she cared for. And yet she appears almost nowhere in the medical case literature of the time, which was concerned overwhelmingly with the health of the family's own children rather than the woman paid to mind them. A nursemaid who sickened was simply dismissed as unsuited to service or replaced when she grew too unwell to continue, her decline recorded nowhere except in the memory of whichever household employed her next, if any did. The broader pattern here says something important about how illness was understood in this era more generally. Victorian medicine, for all its genuine advances in anesthesia, in surgical technique, in the earliest applications of germ theory following the work of Pasteur and Lister, and remained largely a discipline of observed symptoms rather than identified causes when it came to slow, environmental, cumulative harm. A broken bone or a fever with a rash had a visible, nameable origin. A child who simply failed to thrive, over months, in a house that looked by every outward measure clean, comfortable, and well-run, presented a kind of illness the era's medical framework was poorly equipped to trace back to its source, especially when that source was fashionable, expensive, and defended in print by respected men like William Morris. Historians of Victorian domestic medicine, Judith Flanders among them, have noted that this gap between visible respectability and invisible harm runs through nearly every corner of wealthy Victorian life. And the nursery, precisely because it was the room families invested the most care and money into making beautiful, hid some of the deepest versions of that gap. There is something worth sitting with quietly here before we move on. The teething explanation was not a lie told cynically. It was the honest best guess of a caring, attentive physician working within the limits of what his era actually knew. Agnes was not negligent for failing to suspect her walls. She was doing exactly what every experienced nurse in England was doing, which was watching her charges closely, treating their symptoms as best she understood them, and trusting that the room built specifically for their comfort could not possibly be the source of their suffering. If you imagine the toys in a wealthy Victorian nursery, the rocking horse is probably the first image that comes to mind, and after that perhaps a painted doll, a set of building blocks, a small parade of toy soldiers arranged along a windowsill. It is an image of wholesome, old-fashioned play, the kind that modern reproductions and period dramas have made almost aggressively cozy. What that image leaves out is the material those toys were actually made from, and painted with, and what happened when a small child did exactly what small children do with anything placed in front of them, which is put it in their mouth. Toy soldiers are the clearest case, because their composition is so well documented. The classic Victorian toy soldier, whether a solid cast figure bought from a toy shop or a flat, cheaper Nuremberg flat imported from German manufacturers, was not tin in any meaningful sense despite the common name. It was a lead alloy, typically somewhere between 60 and 90% pure lead by weight, mixed with tin and a little antimony to help it cast cleanly and hold fine detail in a mold. Wealthier households bought sets of these figures by the dozen, and it was common practice, particularly among slightly older boys, to melt and recast damaged figures at home using small kits sold for the purpose. A hobby that filled a nursery or schoolroom with fine lead dust from filing rough edges smooth, dust that settled on hands, on toys, on the same surfaces an infant sibling might later crawl across and touch. The figures were then hand-painted in bright reds, blues and blacks, using paints that, in this era, were themselves frequently lead-based, since lead carbonate, known as white lead, and lead oxide compounds were the standard base for durable, opaque paint of every kind, used on furniture, on window frames, on cots, and on toys with equal indifference to who might handle them. The rocking horse presents a quieter, but comparably real version of the same problem. The gleaming, glossy black or dappled grey coat that made a good rocking horse worth its considerable price was achieved with the same lead-based paints used on carriages and shop fronts, chosen because they dried to a hard, glossy, durable finish that could survive years of small hands gripping the mane and small mouths, during the long stretch of teething that occupies roughly the first 2 years of a child's life, closing over whatever edge was within reach. Painted wooden blocks, painted dolls' furniture, the painted bars of a cot itself, all carried the same risk. Quietly, for as long as the paint remained bright enough to be considered presentable. Historians cataloguing Victorian material culture, including museum conservators who have tested surviving nursery pieces in recent decades, have confirmed lead content in original paint layers on toys of exactly this kind, at levels that would be flatly illegal to sell today in any regulated market. The physiological effects of chronic lead exposure in a young child differ somewhat from the arsenic exposure described earlier in this story, though the two shared nursery air more often than either historian or physician of the time ever untangled. Lead is absorbed more readily by a developing body than an adult one, and it accumulates rather than passing through, settling into bone and soft tissue over months and years of small repeated doses. In children, the recognized effects, established by 20th century toxicology working backward from exactly this kind of historical exposure, include irritability, loss of appetite, constipation, abdominal pain that Victorian parents and physicians alike frequently mistook for ordinary colic, and in cases of higher or more prolonged exposure, effects on the developing nervous system that could show up as learning difficulty, behavioral change, or in the most severe and thankfully rarer cases, seizures and swelling of the brain itself. None of this presented as a dramatic, easily traced poisoning. It presented as a fussy child, a child slower than his siblings to speak clearly, a child prone to stomach upset, precisely the vague, unremarkable complaints that filled the pages of every Victorian domestic medicine manual without ever being connected to their true cause. Teddy Ashworth, at 3 years old, is squarely inside the age range where this danger is highest, because he is exactly the age where every object within reach eventually finds its way to his mouth, whether Agnes is watching or not. He has a small set of painted lead soldiers, a gift from an uncle the previous Christmas, that he lines along the nursery windowsill each morning in a ritual arrangement he insists on repeating exactly the same way. Agnes has noticed, without alarm, that the paint on several of the figures has worn thin at the edges where small fingers have handled them most. The bright red of a soldier's coat rubbed down to a duller grey beneath. She has also noticed, and mentioned once in passing to the cook, that Teddy has been a difficult, gripe-prone eater in recent months, prone to stomach complaints that come and go without any obvious pattern she can connect to his food. She has never once considered the soldiers as a cause, because nothing in her training or her experience has given her any reason to. A toy is a toy. A gift from a beloved uncle is, by every social logic available to her, an unambiguous good. The wider picture here connects directly to the wallpaper story that opened this account, because both problems trace back to the same root cause, a manufacturing economy that had, by the middle of the 19th century, achieved remarkable sophistication in producing bright, cheap, durable color, using lead and arsenic compounds precisely because they were the most effective pigments and hardening agents available, without any legal requirement that manufacturers test, disclose, or limit their use in products intended for children. It would take until well into the 20th century, decades after Agnes's lifetime, for most Western countries to formally restrict lead paint on children's items. A regulatory lag that toxicologists and public health historians now regard as one of the clearest examples of how slowly consumer protection followed known scientific danger. Britain's own Pharmacy Act of 1868 had begun to regulate the sale of poisons through chemists' shops, a meaningful step. But it did nothing to touch the paint on a rocking horse or the coating on a toy soldier, because nobody yet classified painted furniture as falling under the same category of risk as a labelled bottle of poison. There is a particular quiet irony worth noticing before this chapter closes. The toys that filled a wealthy Victorian nursery were, almost without exception, more expensive, more elaborately painted, and more brightly coloured than anything a poorer child would ever own, and this was understood by everyone involved as a sign of the child's good fortune. A rich child's rocking horse was dappled and glossy. A rich child's soldiers marched in full painted regalia rather than being carved plain from a scrap of wood. The very qualities that made these toys desirable, the depth and brightness and permanence of their color, were the qualities that made them most dangerous to the small mouths exploring them. A fact nobody in Teddy Ashworth's world had the means to know, and which his uncle, choosing the finest, most detailed set of soldiers the toy shop on Regent Street had to offer, could not possibly have suspected he was placing in harm's way. Which brings us to the question that no polite Victorian household ever discussed openly, but that nearly every nursery in the country, wealthy or poor, was quietly managing on some given night. What do you do with an infant who will not stop crying? At 2 a.m, when you yourself have not slept properly in weeks and there is nobody coming to relieve you? The answer, for a very large number of Victorian households, sat in a small bottle on the nursery shelf, and it had a name designed to sound exactly as reassuring as its contents were not. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, formulated in the United States in the 1830s and sold throughout Britain by the middle of the century, was advertised with an engraving of a plump, contented infant and language, promising rest for mother and child alike. Its actual ingredients, as later chemical analysis confirmed, included a significant quantity of morphine sulfate dissolved in alcohol and flavored to be palatable, along with other soothing agents of the period. A single teaspoon of the syrup carried a dose of morphine roughly comparable to 20 drops of laudanum, at a time when the recommended dose for an infant of 6 months on the bottle's own label was 2 or 3 drops. A gap between advertised safety and actual pharmacology that modern toxicologists regard as almost unbelievable for a product sold openly over a chemist's counter to the parents of newborns. Mrs. Winslow's was, notably, only one name among several doing exactly the same work in exactly the same nurseries. Godfrey's Cordial, an English preparation with roots stretching back into the 18th century, combined opium tincture with treacle and spices into something that looked and tasted, to any adult sampling it, like a warm, sweet medicine rather than a narcotic. Street's infant's quietness promised precisely what its name suggested. Atkinson's infant preservative offered similar relief under a name that, with grim unintended irony, has struck later historians as almost too honest, since what these preparations preserved most reliably was quiet, not necessarily the infant. All of them worked on the same basic pharmacological principle. Opium and its derivatives suppress the central nervous system, including the reflex that drives an infant to breathe, and a crying, restless baby dosed with enough of any of these syrups will, predictably and reliably, fall silent and still. The appeal of these products to an exhausted nursery staff is not difficult to understand, and it deserves to be understood with sympathy rather than judgment. A nurse in Agnes's position, solely responsible through the night for a fretful infant and a small quantity of sleep of her own that she needs desperately in order to function the following day, was not reaching for a bottle of morphine syrup out of cruelty or negligence. She was reaching for the one tool available to her that reliably worked, recommended by other nurses, advertised in respectable publications, sold without any particular secrecy by ordinary chemists, and used, as far as she had any way of knowing, in nurseries very much like her own across the whole of the country. Advice manuals of the period, alongside the testimony of nurses recorded by social investigators later in the century, make clear that dosing a difficult infant to help it sleep was not a shameful, hidden practice confined to careless or overworked households. It was, in a great many nurseries, simply Tuesday. The costs of this practice were nonetheless severe and well documented even by contemporaries who lacked full modern toxicological understanding. Regular dosing built tolerance in an infant's body remarkably quickly, meaning a nurse who found a given amount no longer settled a child might, without any malicious intent, increase the dose to achieve the same effect, moving steadily closer to a quantity capable of suppressing breathing altogether. Physicians and coroners of the period recorded cases of infants who simply did not wake from a dose that would, on other nights, have produced ordinary sleep, their breathing slowed by the drug until it stopped. A death that a family and even an attending doctor might record simply as a child found dead in its cot. Cause unknown. The true mechanism invisible without a chemical analysis nobody thought to request. Infants who survived repeated dosing without a fatal overdose could nonetheless show the marks of chronic exposure familiar from any other form of infant opiate dependency: poor weight gain. Because a sedated infant feeds poorly, listlessness, and a kind of chronic pallor and weakness that once again folded neatly into the same catch-all vocabulary of a delicate constitution that had already absorbed so much of the harm done by arsenical wallpaper and lead paint. In the Ashworth nursery, the bottle in question is a preparation the family's own physician provided rather than one Agnes purchased herself, a mixture the doctor described simply as a soothing draught for the teeth, to be given sparingly when Cecily's fretfulness became severe. Agnes uses it perhaps twice a week, always in the smallest measure the doctor indicated, and she has noticed, without any suspicion attaching to the medicine itself, that Cecily sleeps unusually heavily on the nights she receives it, a heaviness Agnes has interpreted, reasonably enough, as evidence the medicine is doing precisely what it was intended to do. She keeps the small bottle on a high shelf, out of habit rather than any specific fear, and she has never once wondered what is actually inside it, because the label says only that it soothes, and because the family doctor, a man she has been trained her entire working life to trust absolutely, provided it himself. There is a detail worth sitting with here, because it complicates any easy story of villainy. This was not, in the great majority of documented cases, a matter of quack medicine sold by disreputable hucksters to an unsuspecting public, while respectable physicians looked on in horror. Qualified doctors themselves prescribed opium-based preparations for teething infants throughout this period, following medical training and pharmacopoeia that listed opium tinctures as legitimate, useful treatments for infant restlessness and digestive complaint. The difference between a doctor's prescribed draught and a patent bottle bought over the counter was, in practical pharmacological terms, often a matter of degree rather than kind. Both drew on the same basic chemistry. Both carried the same fundamental risk to an infant's fragile, still developing respiratory system. The wealthy household with its own physician was, in this narrow respect, not meaningfully safer than the poorer one relying on a chemist's shelf. A fact that cuts directly against the assumption that money and access to good medical care insulated a Victorian child from this particular danger. Regulation, when it eventually came, arrived slowly and unevenly. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required certain poisons, opium among them, to be sold only by registered chemists and recorded in a poison register, a meaningful step toward tracking who was buying what. But it did little to touch preparations already blended into a branded, sweetened syrup and sold as a proprietary remedy rather than raw opium itself. It would take the systematic public health investigations of the later Victorian and Edwardian periods and eventually formal labelling requirements early in the 20th century for the composition of products like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup to be forced into the open on their own packaging, information that had, in effect, been hidden in plain sight for the better part of a century. What this reveals, beyond the specific danger of any one bottle, is how thoroughly the era's entire apparatus of care, its physicians, its pharmacists, its trusted brand names, its own most devoted and exhausted nurses, could align in good faith around a practice that was quietly killing a portion of the infants it was meant to comfort. Agnes was not failing Cecily by using the doctor's draught sparingly and as directed. She was doing precisely what a conscientious, well-trained nurse of her era was supposed to do, and the fact that this could still end in tragedy in households wealthy and poor alike says less about any individual failing than about how little the science of the day had actually caught up with the chemistry sitting on its own medicine shelves. Feeding, meanwhile, was its own ongoing negotiation, one that touched every household differently depending on whether a mother nursed her own children, employed a wet nurse to do so, or turned, as an increasing number of fashionable households did by the 1880s, to the bottle. Mrs. Ashworth had nursed Teddy briefly, and without much enthusiasm, before handing him to a wet nurse for the remainder of his infancy, a common arrangement among women of her class who found breastfeeding incompatible with the social calendar and the fashionable silhouette both. With Cecily, the household has instead adopted what a great many progressive-minded mothers of the period considered the modern hygienic solution: bottle feeding, using a boiled milk mixture prepared according to the family doctor's instructions and delivered through a bottle purchased, at some expense, from a Bond Street chemist. If you picture a Victorian feeding bottle, you might imagine something resembling a modern one. A simple vessel with a teat fixed directly to its neck, easy to see into and easy to wash. The bottle actually favoured by the era's most fashionable households looked nothing like that. It was typically a flattened, oval or boat-shaped glass vessel, sold under reassuring brand names like Mummy's Darling, the Alexandra, or simply the Empire, with a long rubber tube running from a stopper at one end of the bottle to a rubber teat the infant sucked directly, allowing the bottle itself to sit propped in the cot rather than requiring an adult to hold it throughout a feeding. It was, by the standards of the day, a marvel of convenience, freeing a nurse's hands during exactly the hours she needed them most. It was also, historians and public health researchers who have studied the design agree, one of the single deadliest pieces of nursery equipment ever mass-produced, precisely because of the feature that made it so convenient. The rubber tube was the problem. Milk, drawn up through several inches of narrow rubber tubing by an infant's suck, coated the entire interior surface of that tubing on every single feeding, and the tubing's material, narrow bore, and awkward curved shape made it functionally impossible to clean properly with the brushes and implements available to a Victorian household. Contemporary household advice, when it addressed cleaning the tube at all, sometimes suggested rinsing it after use and washing it thoroughly only once every several days, guidance that reads, to modern eyes trained in basic food safety, as an open invitation to bacterial growth. Milk residue left inside warm, damp rubber tubing for even a single day provides close to ideal conditions for the rapid multiplication of exactly the bacteria responsible for infant gastroenteritis, and a bottle used for days between thorough cleanings, propped in a cot and reused feeding after feeding, delivered a steadily increasing bacterial load directly into an infant's digestive system. With every meal, the consequences showed up in exactly the statistics that alarmed municipal medical officers of health across British cities through the final decades of the century. Infant diarrhea, often recorded under the heading of summer diarrhea because cases spiked sharply in warm weather, when bacterial growth in milk and feeding equipment accelerated fastest, was among the leading recorded causes of infant death throughout the period, and physicians investigating individual cases in wealthier households increasingly pointed toward exactly this style of feeding bottle as a contributing factor entirely independent of the milk's own freshness or the general cleanliness of the household otherwise. A house could be spotless, its linens boiled, its floors scrubbed daily by a full complement of servants, and still deliver a lethal quantity of bacteria to an infant through 8 inches of rubber tubing nobody had thought to treat with the same suspicion applied to a dirty floor. For Agnes, the tube-fed bottle is simply the modern method the doctor recommended, and she follows the cleaning instructions she was given as faithfully as any conscientious nurse would, rinsing the tube after most feedings and giving it a more thorough wash, exactly as the household manual on her shelf advises, roughly twice a week. She has noticed that Cecily has had several bouts of loose, unsettled digestion over recent months, spells that come on for a day or two and then pass, and she has attributed these, as the family doctor himself has attributed them, to the ordinary digestive troubles of a growing infant adjusting to solid food and cow's milk after weaning from the wet nurse. It has not occurred to her, because it had not yet occurred with any real force to the medical profession advising her that the bottle itself, gleaming and modern and expensive as it was, might be feeding her charge a small dose of contamination with every single meal. It is worth pausing on the particular cruelty of the timing here. This exact design of feeding bottle, tube and all, was marketed and sold specifically as an improvement, a hygienic, convenient, forward-looking alternative to older, messier feeding methods, at precisely the moment when the science required to understand why it was dangerous. The germ theory of disease that Pasteur and Koch had only recently established and that had not yet fully filtered down into everyday domestic advice literature was still working its way from laboratories into nursery manuals. A mother who chose the tube bottle over an older, simpler design was, by the logic available to her in 1888, choosing the more modern and more careful option, not a more dangerous one. It would take roughly another decade beyond the events of this story for reform-minded physicians and health visitors to campaign successfully against tube-fed bottles, eventually replacing them in respectable households with simpler, boat-shaped bottles that had no tube at all and could be properly scrubbed after every use. A design change credited with a measurable decline in exactly this category of infant death once it took hold. There is a broader pattern threading through this chapter that connects directly back to the wallpaper and the syrup. In each case, the danger arrived disguised as an improvement, chosen by conscientious parents and conscientious nurses precisely because it represented the most modern, most fashionable, most carefully considered option available to them. Nobody in the Ashworth household was cutting corners. Nobody was choosing the cheap or careless path. The green paper cost more than plain paper. The doctor's draught was a considered medical prescription, not a back-alley remedy. The tube bottle was the height of contemporary feeding technology, sold to households that could afford to buy the very best. Wealth, in this particular story, bought access to danger dressed as innovation just as readily as it bought comfort. And Agnes, doing everything asked of her with genuine care and attention, had no way of seeing the difference. For Agnes, none of this danger and all of it feeding, air, medicine, is the part of nursery life she thinks about most. What occupies her daily attention, far more than any of it, is the strange, formal rhythm the household observes for how much of Teddy and Cecily's parents the children are actually permitted to have. A rhythm so ordinary to everyone involved that nobody in the house considers it worth remarking on. If you imagine a wealthy Victorian mother, you might picture her doting on her children through long, affectionate afternoons, given the money and leisure to do so that a poorer mother, occupied with washing and cooking and paid work, plainly did not have. The actual arrangement in a house like the Ashworths ran almost precisely the opposite way. Mrs. Ashworth sees her children by the household's own settled custom. For one formal period each day, typically in the hour before the evening meal, when Agnes brings Teddy and Cecily downstairs washed, dressed in their good clothes, and presentable in every particular for what the family and the wider culture around them understood as the proper, appropriate quantity of parental attention. Outside that hour, the children belong almost entirely to the nursery, and by extension to Agnes, who has raised both of them through every stage of infancy that their mother has. By design rather than neglect, mostly missed. This was not considered coldness by the standards of the era. It was considered correct child rearing, grounded in a widely held Victorian theory that too much direct parental affection, too much fussing and cuddling and improvised attention spoiled a child's character and undermined the discipline a respectable adult would eventually need. Advice literature aimed at mothers of this class, examined extensively by social historians including Judith Flanders, consistently urged emotional restraint as a virtue, framing the daily nursery visit not as a poor substitute for closeness, but as its correct, measured, healthy form. A mother who spent all day with her children, by this logic, risked raising an indulged, undisciplined adult, while a mother who saw them for a carefully bounded hour, beautifully turned out and on their best behavior, was doing exactly what a responsible parent should. The daily hour itself was, in its own way, a small piece of theatre, and Agnes was its stage manager. Teddy had to be dressed in his good jacket, his hair combed flat, his hands and face scrubbed of any trace of the day's play, and coached, gently but firmly, in the particular quiet, well-mannered behavior expected of him downstairs. No running. No shouting, no interrupting, a question answered promptly and briefly when asked, and silence maintained otherwise. Cecily, still an infant, required less coaching but no less careful presentation, wrapped in her best embroidered gown for the occasion regardless of what she had worn the rest of the day. If either child arrived downstairs fretful, unwashed, or improperly dressed, the failure reflected first and most immediately on Agnes, whose competence was measured largely by how well she could produce, on cue, a version of each child fit for public, or at least parental, display. Clothing itself added its own physical toll to a small body that had, by 3 or 4 years old, already begun to be dressed less like a child at play and more like a miniature adult. Small boys of Teddy's age and class were commonly put into stiffened collars and formal little suits for any occasion involving their parents, and girls only slightly older than Cecily were increasingly laced, as they approached school age, into miniature versions of the stays their mothers wore. Garments that restricted movement, and, in some documented cases discussed by historians of Victorian dress, contributed to shallow breathing and restricted digestion in growing children whose rib cages were still developing. Discipline, too, ran along firmly established lines that a modern parent would find severe, a raised voice or a smack for disobedience considered entirely unremarkable. An accepted and expected tool of a nurse's authority rather than a departure from it. None of this means the bond between Agnes and the children she raised was thin or false. If anything, the opposite was often true, and it is one of the more quietly moving aspects of this entire arrangement, as historians have reconstructed it from letters, memoirs, and household records, because Agnes was present for nearly every one of Teddy's waking hours. Present for his first unsteady steps, his first clear words, his nightmares and his small triumphs. In a way his own mother, by the household's own design, was not. The attachment a child formed to his nurse was frequently the deepest and most consistent emotional bond of his early life. A fact that many Victorian adults, recalling their own childhoods decades later in memoirs and letters, acknowledged with real and sometimes surprising tenderness toward the women who had actually raised them. Teddy, at 3, already runs to Agnes rather than his mother when he falls and scrapes a knee, an instinct nobody in the household considers strange, because everybody in the household understands, without needing to say it aloud, who has actually been present for every scraped knee that came before. And yet this bond carried within it a particular quiet precariousness that no amount of genuine affection could soften. Agnes serves at the pleasure of Mrs. Ashworth entirely, without contract, without notice period guaranteed by any law, and a nurse could be dismissed for reasons ranging from genuine misconduct to simple changes in family circumstance. A move to a smaller house, a mother who decided she preferred a younger nurse, a disagreement over method that the mistress of the house was always going to win. When a nurse was dismissed, she typically left within days, sometimes within hours, and the children she had raised, who might have known no other primary caregiver in their entire conscious lives, were simply expected to accept her sudden absence and transfer their trust to whoever replaced her. Diaries and letters from grown Victorian children recall this rupture, when it happened to them, as one of the more genuinely bewildering losses of their early years, a grief the household rarely acknowledged as grief at all, since a servant's departure was, in the formal terms available to the family, simply a change in staff. The broader pattern here, connecting the appointed hour, the stiff clothing, and the precarious bond between child and nurse, points towards something historians of Victorian family life keep returning to: an entire class-based system of child rearing built around the deliberate, structured limitation of spontaneous affection, in which the person providing nearly all of a child's actual daily comfort was, by design, the person with the least security in the relationship and the least social standing to protect it. Mrs. Ashworth's restrained, formal hour with her children was not read, by anyone in her world, as distance or neglect. It was read as good breeding. The genuine warmth flowing through the household ran instead through Agnes, hidden in plain sight, unpaid attention that nobody with power in the house was obligated to preserve. There is something worth sitting with quietly here. A child raised this way did not necessarily grow up feeling unloved. Many did not. But the love that actually reached them, day after day, arrived through a woman who could be sent away without warning, over whom the child had no say whatsoever, and whose own feelings about the parting were considered, by the standards of the household economy she worked within, entirely beside the point. Underneath every specific danger described so far, the wallpaper, the paint, the syrup, the bottle, sits a larger and less visible problem, one that explains why so many otherwise careful, well-off, well-advised families kept walking into the same hazards for decades on end. Medicine, in 1888, had nothing resembling the regulatory structure a modern parent takes for granted, and nowhere was that gap wider than in the specific care of infants and small children. There was, in this period, no recognized medical specialty devoted to children at all in the sense we would understand today. A family physician like the one attending the Ashworth household trained broadly in general medicine and surgery, picking up whatever additional knowledge of infant care he happened to acquire through experience, apprenticeship, or personal interest, rather than through any standardized course of pediatric study. Pediatrics, as a distinct, formally recognized branch of medicine, was only beginning to take shape in teaching hospitals during exactly this decade, and it would be a generation or more before it became a routine part of every doctor's training. A physician attending a sick infant in 1888 was, in a very real sense, improvising from general principles, guided by textbooks that devoted only a fraction of their attention to the particular physiology of very young children. Layered on top of this thin specialist knowledge was an almost complete absence of the product regulation a modern parent relies on without thinking about it. There was no government body testing wallpaper for arsenic content before it reached a shop shelf. There was no requirement that a feeding bottle demonstrate any standard of safety before being sold under a reassuring brand name. There was no agency inspecting toy paint. The Pharmacy Act of 1868, discussed earlier in this story, represented real progress, requiring registered chemists to record sales of recognized poisons like raw opium and arsenic. But it left enormous categories of consumer goods, patent medicines blended into proprietary syrups, decorative pigments bound into wallpaper and paint, entirely outside its reach, because the law was written to police substances sold as poisons, not substances quietly embedded inside ordinary household products. The patent medicine industry, in particular, operated in this period with a freedom that later generations of regulators would find almost impossible to imagine. A manufacturer could formulate a syrup, name it something reassuring, advertise it in respectable newspapers and ladies' magazines with testimonials and engravings of contented infants, and sell it nationwide without disclosing a single ingredient on the label, so long as the product did not fall under the narrow category of substances the Pharmacy Act specifically named. Consumers, including educated, attentive mothers and nurses, had no legal right to know what they were giving a child, and no practical means of finding out beyond trusting the manufacturer's own advertising copy, which was, unsurprisingly, designed to reassure rather than inform. This regulatory vacuum did not go entirely unchallenged. Reform-minded physicians wrote letters to the Lancet and the British Medical Journal throughout the 1870s and 1880s raising alarm about specific products and practices. much as the correspondence quoted earlier in this story regarding arsenical wallpaper demonstrates. Chemists occasionally published independent analyses exposing the true contents of popular patent remedies. Public pressure, building slowly across these decades, would eventually produce the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, aimed primarily at food adulteration, but gradually extended in later amendments toward medicine as well. And further pharmacy and poisons legislation would follow into the early 20th century. But change of this kind moved at the pace of parliamentary committees and competing commercial interests, not at the pace of any individual nursery's daily needs. And a family raising children in 1888, however wealthy, however well-advised, was operating years or decades ahead of the protections that would eventually address the exact dangers surrounding them. Agnes has no way of knowing any of this in structural terms, though she lives its consequences daily. When she is uncertain about a symptom, a rash, a cough, an unsettled stomach, her only real resources are her own accumulated experience from years in service, the household stock of domestic medicine manuals, and the family doctor, whose visits are occasional and whose authority she has been trained never to question. If the doctor tells her a draught is safe in small doses, she has neither the standing nor the information to ask what precisely is in it. If a wallpaper pattern is fashionable and expensive, she has no reason to imagine a chemist somewhere might find it dangerous, because no chemist has ever been asked to test it, and no law required anyone to ask. Her own judgment, honed over years of careful, attentive nursing, is operating inside a system that had not yet given her, or anyone else in her position, the basic facts she would have needed to protect the children in her care more fully. It is worth noting, too, how little protection existed for Agnes herself within this same gap. There was no occupational health framework of any kind covering domestic servants in this period. No mechanism by which a nurse's chronic headaches, her cracked skin, her persistent low-grade nausea might be investigated as work-related rather than simply personal misfortune. A servant who fell ill was, in the great majority of households, simply a servant who had become less useful, to be nursed back to health if the family felt generous or replaced if they did not. Agnes's own body, absorbing the same arsenic dust and living in the same chemical environment as the children she cared for, had no advocate in the system at all. Not even the limited, imperfect advocacy a family physician occasionally extended toward the children of the house. The pattern connecting all of this is not one of individual carelessness anywhere in the chain. Not in the chemist who formulated the syrup, not in the physician who prescribed it, not in the mother who chose the wallpaper, not in the nurse who administered the dose exactly as instructed. It is a pattern of an entire society operating several critical steps ahead of the science and the law required to keep its own domestic innovations safe, extending that gap most severely into precisely the room, the nursery, and onto precisely the people, infants and the working women who raised them, with the least power to demand better answers. Money bought the newest wallpaper, the most modern feeding bottle, the attention of a private physician rather than a parish doctor. It did not buy protection from a danger that nobody yet had the tools to name. In 1888, a Victorian family of any class opened a newspaper and read death notices in a proportion that would stop a modern reader cold. National figures compiled from the Registrar General's own returns show that across England and Wales through the 1870s and 1880s, somewhere between roughly 130 and 150 infants died for every 1,000 born, before reaching their first birthday, a rate that fluctuated year to year with the severity of summer heat and the prevalence of infectious disease, but never fell dramatically below that grim baseline until well into the following century. To put that plainly, in an average year, something close to 1 infant in 7 or 8 across the whole of the country did not survive their first 12 months of life. This was not treated, by anyone living through it, as a scandal requiring urgent explanation. It was treated as the ordinary, expected, if always painful, background condition of raising a family. What varied enormously, and what historians studying the period have documented in careful detail, was exactly where a family sat within that grim average. In the worst industrial districts, in overcrowded courts in cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and parts of London's East End, infant mortality climbed far above the national figure, at times exceeding 200 deaths per 1,000 births in the poorest, most polluted neighborhoods, driven by contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, overcrowding, and the same kind of unsafe feeding practices already described in this story, made considerably worse by poverty's own additional burdens. Workhouse infirmaries, where the very poorest women gave birth without any of the resources a family like the Ashworths could summon, recorded mortality figures among the highest of all, with some surveys of workhouse birth records from the period finding roughly 1 in 8 infants dying within their very first week of life alone. A figure nearly double the general population's first-week mortality at the time. Against that backdrop, it would be easy to assume that wealth brought something close to safety, and in certain narrow respects it did. A wealthy family had access to a private physician on call rather than an overworked parish doctor managing dozens of patients at once. A wealthy household had clean water, adequate heating, and food in abundant supply, conditions that genuinely did reduce a number of the infectious and nutritional threats that killed poor children in far greater numbers. But the specific dangers explored throughout this story, the arsenical wallpaper, the lead-painted toys, the opiate syrups, the tube-fed bottles, were not diseases of poverty at all. If anything, several of them were more concentrated among families with the means to afford the most fashionable, most modern versions of exactly these products. A poor family's nursery, if it could be called that at all, rarely had the money for imported German lead soldiers or 4 shilling a roll arsenical wallpaper. A poor family's infant, tragically, faced its own equally lethal set of dangers rooted in overcrowding and contaminated milk. But a wealthy family's infant faced dangers rooted specifically in the era's most celebrated, most expensive consumer innovations. This is one of the genuinely striking findings that emerges from looking at the period closely rather than through the comfortable modern assumption that money reliably protects children. Infant death in Victorian Britain was, in this narrow and important sense, a remarkably democratic visitor, arriving through different specific doors depending on a family's income, but arriving into nearly every household regardless, wealthy families included, at a rate that no amount of household staff or fashionable furnishing could fully hold back. Even royal and aristocratic families, with access to the very best medical attention money could buy anywhere in the country, buried infant children with a regularity that would be almost unthinkable in a modern hospital system, a fact recorded plainly in the genealogical records of the era's most prominent families. Agnes has already, in her 4 years with the Ashworths, sat up through one such loss in a previous household, a baby girl who sickened suddenly in her 2nd winter and did not recover, a death the family doctor recorded simply as a wasting decline of unknown origin. Language that, in light of everything explored in this story, now reads very differently than it would have read to anyone standing in that nursery at the time. She keeps a small lock of the child's hair, given to her by the grieving mother as a private, unusual kindness, in the same drawer where she stores her Sunday collar, a memento of a professional loss that carried, for her, a genuine and lasting grief nobody outside that household ever fully acknowledged. The broader cultural response to this constant background presence of infant death shaped nearly every ritual surrounding Victorian family life. Mourning customs for a lost infant were elaborate and widely observed across every class that could afford even modest versions of them. Black-bordered stationery, small formal photographs taken after death when no photograph had been taken in life, delicate mourning jewelry sometimes woven from the child's own hair. All of it evidence of genuine, deep grief rather than emotional distance, even as the same culture maintained the restrained daily habits of nursery life described earlier in this story. Grief and formality were not, in this era, opposites. They coexisted in the same households, sometimes in the same hour, a fact that later generations, looking back at Victorian reticence and assuming it meant indifference, have often misread. There is a quiet observation worth making before this chapter closes. A wealthy Victorian nursery, papered in its beautiful, dangerous green, stocked with its lead-painted comforts and its well-intentioned bottle of soothing syrup, was not a fortress against the era's defining danger to childhood. It was, in its own specific and largely invisible way, simply another set of doors that danger could walk through, dressed differently than the doors it used in a workhouse ward or a crowded tenement room, but leading, often enough, to the exact same small coffin. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what this room would actually have smelled like, because smell, more than almost any other sense, carries the truth a portrait leaves out. A wealthy Victorian nursery in winter was, first and most constantly, a room of coal smoke, since a fire had to be kept burning nearly around the clock to protect infants from the cold in a house with no other reliable heating, and that smoke worked its way into the curtains, the bedding, and the wallpaper itself, mixing over months and years into a permanent, faintly acrid layer beneath whatever cleaner scents the household tried to lay over it. Underneath the coal smoke sat the sharper, chemical tang of chloride of lime, a disinfectant powder used liberally in nurseries of this period to combat the smell and spread of illness, its own harsh mineral odor considered at the time. A reassuring sign of cleanliness and vigilance rather than a warning of anything itself. Camphor, kept in small blocks among linens to ward off moths and thought by some contemporary advice manuals to purify sickroom air, added its own sweetish, medicinal note, one many Victorian adults would associate for the rest of their lives, specifically with childhood illness, since it was reached for at the first sign of a cough or fever. Then there were the smells particular to the specific dangers this story has traced. Damp arsenical wallpaper, when the London winter drove moisture into the walls of even a well-built stucco house, could carry the faint, mousy odour that a small number of unusually attentive contemporaries, once alerted to the possibility, learned to associate with the paper's chemical decay, though most households, Agnes's included, had no reason to notice it as anything other than the ordinary mustiness of an old house in wet weather. The tube of Cecily's feeding bottle, however carefully rinsed, developed over the course of even a single day the faintly sour smell of milk beginning to turn, a smell Agnes has learned to check for as her one available, entirely inadequate warning system for whether the bottle needed washing again, unaware that the danger she could not smell yet was already present regardless. The small bottle of the doctor's soothing draught, kept on its high shelf, carried the sweet, slightly bitter scent common to opium tinctures of the period, a smell many Victorian adults later recalled from their own childhoods with an odd, complicated fondness, since it was bound up entirely with memories of comfort and sleep rather than danger. If you had walked from the Ashworth's nursery to a nursery in a poorer household in the same city, the smells would have told an equally honest, differently weighted story. A tenement room doubling as a nursery for several children at once carried none of the coal smoke's relative luxury, since fuel itself was rationed carefully against a family's limited means, and carried instead the sharper, more immediate smells of overcrowding, unwashed bedding changed less often for want of replacements, and the sourness of milk that had travelled further and sat longer before reaching an infant's mouth, often already turning before it was ever poured. The specific chemical dangers differed by class. Arsenic and lead concentrated more heavily in wealthier homes that could afford the products carrying them, while contamination and overcrowding weighed more heavily on poorer ones. But the underlying sensory truth, a nursery air thick with the era's unexamined compromises, ran through every stratum of British society in 1888. Differing in its particular notes but never in its fundamental presence. For Agnes, these smells are simply the unremarkable texture of her working life, noticed only at the margins, the way anyone stops consciously registering an odour they live inside every day. She has, over 4 years, developed her own private catalogue of nursery scents that means something to her without her ever having articulated the connections precisely. The specific staleness that means the fire needs tending. The specific sourness that means the bottle needs washing sooner than scheduled. The specific quality of a child's breath that means a fever is beginning before any thermometer would confirm it. This catalogue represents a genuine, hard-won expertise built entirely from attention and repetition rather than formal training, and it is, in its limited way, more finely tuned to the actual daily welfare of Teddy and Cecily than anything the family's occasional physician brings with him on his infrequent visits. It simply was not, and could not have been, tuned to dangers that the science of the day had not yet taught anyone, including the physicians themselves, to notice. There is a broader truth worth naming plainly here, at the close of this survey of the room and everything inside it. The Victorian nursery, across every class that maintained one, was defined less by any single danger than by a general condition, an entire domestic world operating with genuine care, real affection, and considerable expense, layered directly on top of a set of chemical and biological hazards that nobody involved had the tools to perceive. This was not a story of neglect. It was a story of diligence outpacing knowledge, of mothers and nurses doing precisely what their era's best available wisdom told them to do, and discovering, sometimes only in hindsight, sometimes not at all, that the wisdom itself had not yet caught up with the walls, the toys, the medicine, and the bottles surrounding the children in their care. The quiet observation to carry forward from this chapter, and from every chapter before it, is simple enough to state plainly. Cleanliness, comfort, and modernity, the three qualities a wealthy Victorian household prized above nearly all others in raising its children, were not the same thing as safety, no matter how completely the era believed otherwise. And Agnes, standing each evening in a room that smelled of coal smoke, camphor, and a sweetness she had no name for, was doing everything asked of a good nurse in 1888, in a room that asked more of her and of the children sleeping in it than either she or anyone advising her yet understood. There is a detail from outside the nursery walls worth carrying into this story before it closes, because it explains why nobody in the Ashworth household, or in any household like it, felt any particular alarm about the specific dangers gathered under one small roof. Arsenic and opium were not confined to the nursery in Victorian Britain. They ran through the whole fabric of fashionable life, present in so many ordinary products that a family encountering them in their children's room had no reason to treat the nursery as unusual. Consider the wider household Agnes moves through on her rare hours off duty. Mrs. Ashworth's own dressing table holds, among its powders and creams, small wafers sold under names like arsenic complexion tablets, marketed to fashionable women as a means of achieving the pale, luminous, almost translucent skin the era prized above nearly every other beauty standard. The wafers working, to whatever degree they worked at all, by introducing small measured doses of arsenic into the bloodstream, on the theory, not entirely wrong in its narrow chemistry, that arsenic could produce a temporary flush and later pallor in the skin. Ball gowns in the same vivid coveted green as the nursery wallpaper were dyed with the identical arsenical pigments, worn for entire evenings against bare arms and necks already dampened with the perspiration of dancing. A combination that period physicians occasionally linked to skin irritation and, in a small number of widely reported cases involving artificial flowers and gauze dresses, to fatal poisoning among the young women who manufactured them in poorly ventilated workshops rather than the wealthier women who wore the finished garments. Even confectionery was not entirely safe from the era's casual relationship with the pigment, as the notorious Bradford poisoning of 1858, in which a batch of peppermint sweets was accidentally adulterated with arsenic trioxide instead of the harmless filler intended, and killed more than 20 people, mostly children, demonstrated on a scale too large and too sudden to be misdiagnosed as anything but what it was. Opium moved through adult life with an equally casual presence. Laudanum, A tincture of opium in alcohol sat in most respectable medicine cabinets as a standard remedy for adult ailments ranging from headache to menstrual pain to simple insomnia, sold openly by any chemist and used by countless Victorian adults, including, by her own admission in later letters, Mrs. Ashworth herself, who kept a small bottle for what she described only as her nerves. A household in which the mistress of the house treated her own occasional sleeplessness with a tincture of opium had, in the most literal sense, no internal logic available to it for objecting to a milder version of the same substance being used to settle a fretful infant. The two practices drew on the same medicine chest, the same chemist's shop, and the same basic cultural assumption that opium, taken in the right small measure, was simply medicine, no more alarming in principle than any other remedy on the shelf. What this wider context reveals is something more unsettling than a single dangerous nursery habit considered in isolation. The specific dangers gathered inside the Ashworth nursery were not aberrations within an otherwise safe household. They were concentrated, more intimate versions of substances and practices that ran through nearly every room of a fashionable Victorian home and through the fashionable world beyond its front door. From the ballroom to the dressing table to the sweet shop. Agnes had no reason to treat the nursery's green wallpaper or its bottle of soothing draught with any special suspicion, because nothing else in her experience of this household or of the wider society it belonged to suggested that arsenic or opium, encountered in careful measure, was anything other than an accepted, unremarkable feature of a well-run, fashionable life. This normalization was, historians of the period agree, precisely what allowed the danger to persist as long as it did. A single alarming product might have been withdrawn quickly once its dangers surfaced. An entire category of substances woven this thoroughly through fashion, medicine, food coloring, and domestic comfort required a correspondingly broad and slow shift in public understanding before any of it could be dislodged. A shift that depended not on any single dramatic revelation, but on the patient accumulation, case by case, correspondence by correspondence, of physicians and chemists willing to keep insisting on an uncomfortable connection that fashionable society had every commercial and social incentive to dismiss. The quiet observation to take from this wider view is that Agnes's household was not an outlier in its casual relationship with these substances. It was, in nearly every particular, entirely typical of its class and its moment, which is precisely what makes the story worth telling with such care. The danger did not require a careless household to take root. It required only an ordinary one, doing everything its era considered sensible, surrounded on every side by a culture that had not yet learned to be afraid of the things it should have feared. For all the dangers explored so far, the substances in the walls, the paint, the medicine chest, there is a quieter arithmetic underlying the entire arrangement that deserves its own honest accounting, because it explains exactly why a woman like Agnes accepted risks she did not know she was taking, in a role that asked nearly everything of her and returned, in strictly material terms, remarkably little. A head nurse in a household of the Ashworth standing earned, by the wage scales typical of the 1880s documented in domestic service manuals and household account books of the period, somewhere in the region of £18 to £25 a year, plus her board, her uniform, and a shared or, if she was fortunate, a small private room within the nursery itself. This placed her comfortably above a housemaid or a kitchen servant in the household hierarchy, a genuine achievement for a woman who had begun her working life at 15 scrubbing floors, and it placed her nowhere near the income of the governess employed a few years later to teach Teddy his letters in a schoolroom rather than a nursery, a distinction that mapped closely onto class origin and education rather than onto the actual difficulty or importance of the work performed. Agnes, responsible for 2 children's health, safety, feeding, discipline, and daily happiness across nearly every waking and sleeping hour, earned in a year roughly what Mr. Ashworth might spend on a single well-appointed dinner party for a dozen guests. The isolation built into the role was as significant as the wage itself. A live-in nurse had, in practice, one half-day a fortnight to herself, occasionally a full Sunday if the household's habits allowed it. Time she typically spent, as Agnes does, writing to family who lived too far away to visit easily, or walking alone through streets she rarely had leisure to enjoy. Marriage was, for most women in this specific role, effectively incompatible with continued employment, since households expected an unmarried nurse who could devote herself entirely to the children in her care without the competing claims of a husband or children of her own. An expectation so thoroughly embedded in the culture of domestic service that a nurse who did marry generally understood. She was leaving the profession as she did so. Agnes, at 32, has quietly accepted this trade without much visible bitterness, though she has mentioned to Polly, in one of the rare unguarded moments between them, that she sometimes wonders what her life might have looked like had she stayed in Norfolk and taken up with the farmer's son who once walked her home from church. There is a particular, less discussed corner of this economic arrangement that historians of domestic service, drawing on the records of registry offices and the occasional surviving nurse's memoir, have brought into sharper focus in recent decades. Register offices, which matched women seeking nursery positions with families seeking staff, generally required references attesting not only to a candidate's competence but to her respectability, a term that in practice excluded women who had borne children outside marriage, regardless of the circumstances, from ever working again as a nurse in a respectable household. A small number of women who found themselves pregnant while in service faced an impossible choice between keeping a child they could not support while employed and surrendering that child, sometimes permanently, to relatives or to institutional care. In order to preserve the only livelihood available to them, care of somebody else's children in exchange for a wage that made raising their own, in the same breath, functionally impossible. This is not Agnes's own story, but it was the story of women she trained alongside and occasionally corresponded with, and it sat, unspoken but understood, as one of the harder edges of the profession she had chosen. Set against this economic and social precarity, the affection Agnes has built with Teddy and Cecily reads as something closer to a lifeline than a simple professional attachment. The children's small triumphs, a first clearly spoken word, a nightmare soothed back into sleep, represent, for Agnes, some of the only unambiguous rewards available to her in an arrangement that otherwise offered modest pay, little personal freedom, and no guarantee of continued employment beyond the family's ongoing satisfaction with her work. It would be a mistake to read this bond as compensation calculated to offset its costs. It was, more simply and more movingly, the genuine center of a life that had been organized, by economic necessity rather than personal choice, around the near total absence of any other center. The broader pattern here connects directly back to everything this story has traced through the wallpaper, the medicine, and the appointed hour of parental affection. Wealthy Victorian households built nurseries that looked, from every visible angle, like sanctuaries of comfort and privilege, staffed by women whose own economic position inside those same households was precarious, poorly compensated, and almost entirely dependent on a family's continued goodwill. The safety and comfort on display in a room like the Ashworths' nursery rested, in the most literal sense, on the underpaid, insecure, physically demanding labor of a woman who had given up nearly everything else in her own life to provide it. A debt the household repaid in board, in a small wage, and, when it was generous, in genuine warmth, but never in the security or recognition the work itself would seem to warrant. The quiet observation worth sitting with here, before this story turns toward its larger conclusions, is this. Agnes was not a footnote to the story of the Ashworth children's upbringing. She was, in every practical sense, its primary author, and the household that depended on her so completely offered her, in return, remarkably little beyond the privilege of continuing to do the work she had, by every account available to us, come to love. There is one more hazard left to name before this account steps back to consider the larger pattern, and it is, in some ways, the most immediate and most visibly acknowledged of them all. because unlike arsenic or opium, it did not require any chemist's testimony to prove. Everyone in a Victorian household understood, in principle, that an open coal fire was dangerous. What the era's own habits of clothing and childcare did, in practice, was place small children directly beside that danger for hours every day, dressed in exactly the fabric best suited to turn a moment's carelessness into a fatal one. The nursery fire was, as earlier chapters have already established, a near constant fixture through the colder months, since it provided the only reliable heat in a house otherwise reliant on drafty windows and thick curtains to hold warmth. A fireguard, typically a simple mesh or bar screen set in front of the hearth, was standard nursery equipment in any household that could afford one. And the Ashworth's nursery has one. A solid brass-framed piece Agnes checks and latches every evening as part of her closing routine. But a fireguard of this period was a modest, low barrier, designed more to catch a stray coal than to prevent a determined or unsteady child from reaching the flames themselves, and it did nothing at all to address the danger once a child. Dressed for bed or for play, stood or knelt anywhere near the hearth's radiant heat. The clothing itself carried much of the actual risk. Flannelette, a soft brushed cotton fabric that became enormously popular for children's nightgowns and everyday dresses through the middle and later decades of the century, precisely because it was cheap, warm, and comfortable against young skin. Also happened to be exceptionally easy to ignite and, once burning, prone to flare rather than smolder, spreading flame rapidly across its raised fuzzy surface. A nightgown brushing too near an open flame, whether a nursery fire, a candle, or a gas jet, could catch in an instant, and the loose, full cut favoured for children's nightwear meant that once alight, the fabric burned upward toward the face and throat with a speed that gave a small child, and often the adult nearby, only seconds to react. Coroner's inquest records surviving from this period, examined in recent decades by historians researching the long history of burn injury in Britain, document hundreds of cases of exactly this kind concentrated in ordinary domestic settings across the second half of the 19th century, the overwhelming majority involving children between roughly 2 and 5 years old. Precisely the age at which a child is mobile enough to wander near a hearth unsupervised for even a moment, but not yet capable of recognizing or escaping the danger on their own. Wealthier households were not immune to this danger, despite their better fireguards and their fuller staff of servants watching over the children. If anything, the fashionable insistence on delicate, elaborately trimmed nightwear and dressing gowns for children of good family, cut from the same soft, flammable cottons and muslins prized for their appearance rather than any safety consideration, meant that a well-off child was often dressed in precisely the fabric most likely to ignite quickly, at the exact hours. Bedtime and the hour before it, when a nursery fire burned hottest to warm the room for sleep. Agnes has long since developed her own private caution around this danger, keeping Teddy at what she judges a safe distance from the grate during his bedtime prayers, and instructing Polly firmly never to leave either child alone in the room while the fire is lit, a rule she enforces not because any manual has told her to, but because she has heard, through the low constant traffic of gossip between nurses in service across the neighbouring houses, of at least one child in a nearby household who suffered severe burns the previous winter when a nightgown caught from an unguarded candle left on a low table. This particular danger differs from the others explored in this story in one important respect. It was, unlike arsenic in wallpaper or morphine in a soothing syrup, a hazard the culture at large did recognize and did attempt to address, through fireguards, through the accumulated caution of experienced nurses like Agnes, and eventually, well into the 20th century, through legislation requiring safety guards around domestic hearths in homes with young children. The awareness existed. What lagged behind it, as with so much else in this story, was the practical means of eliminating the danger entirely, rather than simply managing it as carefully as an individual household's resources and vigilance allowed. A fireguard could catch a rolling coal. It could not, by itself, keep a curious 3-year-old and a flammable nightgown reliably apart from an open flame for every hour of every winter evening across an entire childhood. The broader context worth drawing from this final hazard is a small but important corrective to anything in this story that might read as a simple tale of ignorance. Victorian parents and nurses were not blind to every danger surrounding their children. They understood fire. They feared it, guarded against it, and passed warnings about it between households with real urgency. What they lacked, in this case as in every other explored tonight, was not awareness of risk in general, but the specific scientific or regulatory knowledge required to see the particular, less visible dangers, the ones hidden in a paint pigment or a medicine bottle, with the same clarity they brought to a danger as old and as visibly obvious as an open flame. There is one particular night in the Ashworth nursery worth telling in full, not because it ended in tragedy, but because it very nearly did, and because the shape of that near miss gathers together almost every thread this story has already traced. It happened in February of that same winter, on Agnes's fortnightly half-day, the one stretch of hours she reserves entirely for herself. She had gone to visit a cousin in service 2 streets away, leaving Polly, 15 years old and 18 months into her training, alone with both children for the evening. Cecily had been unusually fretful since midday, crying in the particular high, unbroken way that Agnes herself would have recognized instantly as something beyond ordinary tiredness. But Polly, still learning to read these signals with the same fluency Agnes had built over years, interpreted the crying as teething. Precisely the catch-all explanation every manual and every senior servant in her short experience had trained her to reach for first. Following the instructions she had watched Agnes follow many times before, Polly measured out a dose of the doctor's soothing draught from the bottle on its high shelf. And when Cecily did not settle after the first dose, gave a second, smaller measure roughly an hour later, reasoning, not unkindly, that a fretful child who had not yet quieted simply needed a little more of the medicine that was supposed to help her. By the time Agnes returned a little after 9, Cecily was not crying at all. She was, Agnes noted with the particular unease of someone whose ear had been trained by years of listening for exactly this kind of silence, sleeping far too heavily, her breathing shallow and slow in a way that did not match the ordinary, deep, even sleep Agnes had learned to recognize as healthy. She could not rouse the child fully. A gentle shake produced only a faint, unfocused stirring rather than the usual startled cry. Agnes, drawing on instinct rather than any medical training she had ever formally received, sent Polly running for the doctor immediately and spent the intervening half hour doing the only things she knew to try, keeping Cecily upright against her shoulder, walking her steadily around the small room, talking to her in a low, constant voice, watching her chest rise and fall with an attention that made the previous 4 years of watching over other children's sleep feel, for the first time, entirely inadequate to the moment. The doctor arrived within the hour and confirmed what Agnes had already begun to suspect without having the words for it. Cecily had received more of the drought than her small body could safely absorb in so short a span, and her breathing had slowed as a direct result. The same mechanism, described earlier in this story, by which infants across the country were quietly dying in their cots on nights considerably less fortunate than this one. The doctor kept her walking and stimulated through the remainder of the night, and by morning her breathing and colour had returned to normal, leaving no lasting harm that anyone in the household could detect, though Agnes would watch her with a particular private vigilance for weeks afterward that she never fully explained to anyone, including herself. Nobody in the household treated this as anything other than a near accident, a lesson learned about dosage and about leaving Polly with too much responsibility too soon in her training. The doctor's own explanation to Mrs. Ashworth, delivered in the calm, measured tone of a man confident in his own understanding, was that the draught, given carefully and in the prescribed small amount, remained perfectly safe, and that the error lay entirely in Polly's inexperience rather than in the medicine itself. Agnes, listening from the hallway as she was expected to, said nothing, though she privately resolved never again to leave the bottle within Polly's reach without direct supervision. A resolution born of instinct and fright, rather than any deeper understanding of what she had actually witnessed that night. What Agnes could not have known, and what the doctor himself did not fully grasp either, is that the danger she had glimpsed was not a rare failure of an otherwise safe system. It was the ordinary mechanism of harm this entire story has traced, playing out on one particular night with an outcome that happened. Through Agnes's quick instinct and a doctor who reached the house in time to end in relief rather than grief. Elsewhere in England that same winter, in households with less experienced nurses, less attentive mistresses, or simply less fortunate timing, an identical sequence of events, a fretful infant, a well-meaning increase in dosage, a slowing of breath nobody caught in time, ended instead exactly the way the coroner's records already quoted in this story describe, a child found still in its cot. Cause recorded as unknown, the true cause sitting quietly on a shelf in the very room where the death occurred. This is worth carrying forward as the story turns toward its close, because it resists the comfortable idea that the households in this account were simply unlucky, or that the dangers described were freak occurrences rather than the ordinary operating conditions of an entire era's approach to childcare. Agnes did not have privileged knowledge that other nurses lacked. She had a sharper instinct, built from more years of close attention, and she had on this particular night enough time and enough of the doctor's competence to correct an error before it became irreversible. The margin between the Ashworth Nursery's frightening night and another family's genuine tragedy was, in the end, remarkably thin, resting on nothing more reliable than one experienced woman's trained ear for the particular silence that meant something was wrong. Step back now from the wallpaper, the toys, the syrup, the bottle, the fire, and the long list of specific dangers this story has walked through one by one, and a smaller number of larger patterns begin to come into focus. Patterns that connect the Ashworth Nursery to nearly every household of its class across the whole of Victorian Britain. The first pattern is this. Every single danger described in this story arrived disguised as an improvement. Nobody chose arsenical wallpaper because it was cheap or careless. They chose it because it was the most vivid, most fashionable, most expensive color available. A visible marker of taste and prosperity. Nobody prescribed the soothing draught because they wished to sedate an infant into danger. They prescribed it because it was the standard, medically sanctioned answer to a genuine and exhausting problem, a crying child in the middle of the night. Nobody bought the tube-fed bottle because it was inferior to the alternatives. They bought it because it represented, by the era's own understanding of hygiene and convenience, the single most modern feeding method money could buy. Across every chapter of this account, the pattern holds without exception. Danger did not enter these nurseries through neglect. It entered dressed as care, wrapped in exactly the packaging that a loving, attentive, well-resourced family was trained to trust most. The second pattern follows closely from the first, and it concerns the specific relationship between money and safety that this story has tested against nearly every hazard it describes. Wealth did not protect a Victorian child from danger. It changed the shape of the danger a child faced. A poor infant in a crowded tenement faced contaminated water, inadequate food, and the desperate corner-cutting compromises that poverty forces onto even the most devoted parent. A wealthy infant in a nursery like the Ashworths faced arsenic in the color, chosen specifically because it was too expensive for a poorer family to afford, lead in toys imported at a cost no labouring family could match. And a physician's carefully prescribed medicine that operated by the exact same chemistry as the cheapest patent bottle on a poor chemist's shelf. The national mortality figures already discussed in this story bear this out with a kind of grim clarity. Infant death in 1888 did not spare the nursery with the lace curtains and the private doctor. It simply knocked on a differently decorated door. The third pattern concerns the women who carried nearly all of the actual physical weight of this arrangement, and it is perhaps the pattern most easily lost if this story were told only through statistics and chemistry rather than through one particular nurse's particular nights. Agnes absorbed the same arsenic dust as the children in her care, breathed the same air, handled the same syrup bottle, and possessed, in the end, none of the security, none of the medical advocacy, and very little of the wages that might have reflected the true weight of what she carried. The culture that built these beautiful, dangerous nurseries did so on the labor of women whose own health, whose own limited freedom, and whose own precarious hold on employment were treated as entirely separate questions from the safety of the children they raised, when in fact, as this story has shown again and again, the two were inseparable. A nurse who did not know what was in the wallpaper could not protect herself from it any more than she could protect the infant asleep beside her. The fourth and final pattern is the slowest to resolve, and the one that connects this particular winter in 1888 to everything that came afterward. Every single danger catalogued in this account was, in time, addressed, not through any sudden revelation but through the patient accumulation of physicians' letters, chemists' analyses, coroners' inquests, and public pressure building across decades. Arsenical wallpaper fell out of fashion by the close of the century as the weight of medical evidence became impossible to keep denying, even for a man as influential as William Morris. Lead paint on children's items would eventually be restricted by law, though not for another several decades beyond Agnes's own lifetime. Patent medicines would be forced, gradually and against considerable commercial resistance, to disclose their contents, and pediatrics would grow into a genuine, dedicated medical specialty with its own body of knowledge specific to the developing infant body. The tube-fed bottle would be replaced within a generation by simpler, cleanable designs, driven by exactly the kind of public health campaigning this story has described. None of these reforms arrived in time to help Agnes, or Teddy, or Cecily, directly. They arrived because families like the Ashworths and nurses like Agnes lived through exactly the risks this story has traced, in numbers large enough and consistent enough that the pattern eventually became undeniable to the people with the power to change it. There is something clarifying about seeing all of this laid out together rather than as a series of isolated, unlucky mistakes. The Victorian nursery was not a system that failed occasionally. It was a system operating, with real diligence and real love, several critical steps ahead of the knowledge required to make good on its own promises of safety, and it stayed that way for as long as it did precisely because every individual actor within it, the mother choosing the wallpaper, the doctor prescribing the draught, the nurse administering it, the manufacturer selling the bottle, was behaving exactly as a careful, well-intentioned person of their era was supposed to behave. The tragedy, where tragedy occurred, was rarely a failure of character. It was a failure of collective knowledge, distributed across an entire society that had not yet learned to ask the right questions of its own most treasured domestic comforts. Return, for a moment, to the room where this story began. It is still that same winter evening in 1888, the fire still throwing its warm light across the iron cot and the dapple-grey rocking horse, the green wallpaper still glowing with the particular saturated richness that made it the most coveted colour in London that season. Teddy still stands very still while Agnes buttons the last button of his good jacket, and Cecily still sleeps in her cot with one small fist curled beside her ear. From the doorway, nothing about the scene has changed. It is still, by every visible measure, a beautiful picture. But you are not looking at it the same way anymore. You know now that the walls behind Teddy's small shoulders carry, in every square foot of their vivid green pattern, a compound that chemists of the coming decades would recognize instantly as a poison. Flaking invisibly into the air these children breathe through every one of the 16 or 18 hours a day they spend in this room. You know that the neat row of painted soldiers on the windowsill, arranged by Teddy each morning in the same careful order, is cast from an alloy that is mostly lead, coated in paint that is very likely the same, waiting for exactly the kind of small exploring mouth that a 3-year-old cannot help but bring to anything he holds. You know that the small bottle on the high shelf, prescribed by a physician Agnes has been trained her entire working life to trust without question, carries a dose of morphine that has already, on one frightening February night, slowed an infant's breathing nearly past the point of return. And that elsewhere in England on other nights. In other nurseries built with exactly this same care and exactly this same love. That same slowing did not stop in time. You know that the gleaming feeding bottle by the cot, with its long rubber tube nobody in this house has ever been told to scrub daily rather than weekly, is quietly delivering, meal by meal, a bacterial load that public health investigators of the coming years will trace directly to exactly this kind of tube-fed design. You know that within the hour, Teddy will be taken downstairs for 60 careful minutes with his own parents, the single formal measure of direct affection the household considers correct and sufficient, before being returned to the woman who has actually raised him through every other hour of his short life. A woman who could, with a single dissatisfied word from Mrs. Ashworth, be sent away within days. And you know Agnes now too. You know that the headaches she keeps to herself, the cracked skin at her knuckles, the low persistent nausea she has explained away as something disagreeing with her at supper, may well be the same slow chemistry working through her own body that is working through the children she loves, absorbed through the same walls, the same dust, the same air she has breathed for 4 years running. You know that she earns, in a full year of this constant, skilled, exhausting attention, roughly what the family she serves might spend on a single evening's entertaining. You know that she has given up marriage, a household of her own, and very possibly children of her own, to build her entire adult life around the care of somebody else's, and that the affection Teddy shows her when he runs to her, rather than his own mother after a scraped knee, is not a small or incidental thing. It is, for both of them, very close to the center of everything. None of this was hidden from view because anyone involved was careless, or cruel, or indifferent to the children in their care. It was hidden because the science required to see it, the toxicology, the germ theory, the basic regulatory instinct to test a product before selling it to a family with an infant, had not yet caught up with the era's own considerable appetite for fashion, comfort, and domestic innovation. Mrs. Ashworth chose the green wallpaper because it was beautiful and because everyone she respected chose something very like it. The family physician prescribed the soothing draught because it was standard, sanctioned medical practice, taught to him in the same terms it had been taught to physicians for a generation before him. Agnes administered it and cleaned the bottle on the schedule she had been shown, and comforted a fretful child in the middle of the night, using every tool her training and her experience had given her. Because that is precisely what a devoted, competent, hard-working nurse in 1888 was supposed to do. This is not a story that asks you to judge any of them. It asks you to see them clearly, which is a different and in some ways a harder thing. Mrs. Ashworth was not a negligent mother for trusting her physician and her wallpaper merchant. She was behaving exactly as a conscientious woman of her class, and her moment was trained to behave, and there is no version of 1888 in which she could reasonably have known better. The family doctor was not a quack or a fraud. He was working at the honest edge of what his profession understood, prescribing the best tool available to him for a genuine and difficult problem, an infant's distress in the small hours of the night. And Agnes, who carried more of the actual daily weight of this arrangement than anyone else in the house, who noticed more, worried more, and knew these two small bodies more intimately than either of their own parents did, was not a bystander to any of it. She was, in every meaningful sense, the person actually keeping Teddy and Cecily alive, day after day, inside a room that was working quietly against her without her knowledge, and very nearly, on one February night, without her forgiveness. It would be easy, looking back from a safe distance of well over a century, to feel a kind of comfortable superiority toward this whole arrangement, to shake our heads at the wallpaper, the lead soldiers, the opium in the medicine chest, and to imagine that we, with our modern testing and our modern regulation, would surely have known better. That comfort deserves to be examined honestly, rather than simply enjoyed. Every one of the specific protections that make a modern nursery safer than the Ashworth's green-papered room, pigment regulation, child-proof medicine labeling, safety-tested feeding equipment, an entire recognized medical specialty devoted to the developing infant body, exists precisely because families like this one, and nurses like Agnes, lived through exactly these risks in large enough numbers, for long enough that the pattern eventually became impossible for anyone to keep denying. The safety we now take for granted in an ordinary nursery was purchased, quite literally, with the health and in some cases the lives of the children and the caregivers who came before. It was understood, a debt worth remembering rather than a comfortable distance worth congratulating ourselves on. There is something else worth carrying away from this particular winter evening, something gentler than the accounting of danger that has filled most of this story. For all that this nursery held inside its walls, its wallpaper, its medicine, its rigid formal hour of parental affection, it also held something that no chemist's report and no coroner's inquest ever fully captures, which is the plain, daily, unglamorous devotion of a woman who spent nearly every hour of her adult life making sure 2 children she had not given birth to felt safe, warm, and cared for, in a world that gave her remarkably little in return for doing so. Agnes did not know what was in her walls. She did know, with complete and unwavering certainty, that Teddy needed his jacket buttoned just so before facing his parents, that Cecily settled more easily with a particular low hum than with any other sound, that a scraped knee wanted a specific kind of steady, unhurried comfort rather than a hurried one. That knowledge, built entirely from attention and repetition and genuine care, was real, and it mattered. And it does not become smaller or less true simply because the room around her held dangers she could not see. Teddy Ashworth, as it happens, grew into a healthy man. One of the fortunate outcomes this story has been careful throughout to note were never guaranteed. Cecily did as well, carrying no visible trace into adulthood of the frightening night in February when her breathing slowed nearly past the point of return. Agnes remained with the family for several years more before, according to the fragmentary records such women typically left behind, taking a position with a household in Kent, her name appearing afterward only in the scattered, incomplete way that the working lives of Victorian domestic servants usually do, present in a census return here, a reference letter there, and then, eventually, nowhere at all, the way most such live simply close without ceremony once the record-keeping world of the wealthier families they served stops having occasion to mention them. That quiet disappearance from the record is, in its own way, a fitting place to leave her. Agnes was never meant to be seen. She was meant to be present, constantly, invisibly, buttoning jackets and checking fire guards and measuring careful doses from a bottle she had no reason to distrust, holding together, through sheer daily attentiveness, a version of childhood the culture around her had built to look effortless and safe. It was neither. It required everything she had, and it asked her to give it inside walls that were, in ways nobody around her yet understood, working quietly against the very safety she was trying so hard to provide. The nursery is still gold in the firelight. The rocking horse still stands dapple-grey and patient in the corner. Somewhere below, in a drawing room warmed by its own fire, a mother and father are waiting for their allotted hour with a small, freshly buttoned boy and a sleeping infant girl. And none of them know yet what this room is quietly doing to the people inside it. You know now. That is not a comfortable kind of knowledge, and it was never meant to be. But it is a true one, and it belongs, at last, to the woman who spent 4 winters in that room, without ever once being given the chance to ask. Multiply this one nursery by every fashionable house in London that chose the same vivid green that season, by every household that kept the same bottle of soothing draught on the same high shelf, by every nurse across the country doing exactly what Agnes did, with exactly the same care and exactly the same blind trust in the world that had trained her, and the scale of what this story has been describing comes into sharper focus. This was never really a story about one family, or one nursery, or one unusually unlucky choice of wallpaper. It was the ordinary condition of wealthy childhood across an entire country for the better part of 2 generations, repeated in nursery after nursery, county after county, with only the smallest variations in wallpaper pattern or the particular brand name printed on the soothing bottle. It is worth remembering, too, that the people living through this story did not experience it as a story of danger at all. They experienced it as an ordinary Tuesday, an ordinary bedtime, an ordinary fretful evening managed with the ordinary tools available to a careful household. Agnes did not think of herself as a woman navigating hidden peril each time she buttoned Teddy's jacket or measured a careful dose from the shelf. She thought of herself, when she thought of it at all, as a competent nurse doing her job well, and by the honest standards of her own time, she was exactly that. The danger in this story is visible to us only because we are standing somewhere she could never have stood, a full century further along the slow, uneven path by which a society learns, case by case, correspondence by correspondence, exactly what its own comforts have been quietly costing it. That distance is worth sitting with gently rather than smugly. Every room you have ever slept in, every product you have ever trusted because it came in familiar packaging and carried a reassuring name, exists inside its own version of exactly the gap this story has traced. A gap between what current science has proven and what current fashion, convenience, and habit have already made ordinary. It is not a comfortable thought, and it is not offered here to frighten you before sleep. It is offered because Agnes deserves that honesty more than she deserves our easy hindsight, and because the quiet, patient work of narrowing that gap, the work of chemists and physicians and coroners and reformers willing to keep insisting on an uncomfortable connection long after fashionable society wished they would stop, is the entire reason a nursery today looks nothing like the one she tended. Picture her one last time, not in the frightening moment of the February night, and not in the grand sweep of statistics this story has walked through, but in an ordinary, unremarkable evening, much like the one that opened this account. The fire is banked low now. Teddy has said his prayers and been tucked beneath his blankets, his row of painted soldiers standing sentry on the windowsill exactly as he left them. Cecily sleeps in her cot, her breathing even and slow in the way Agnes has learned through years of close attention to recognize as simply and purely healthy. Agnes herself sits for a moment in the one chair the nursery affords her, her hands finally still after a day that asked nearly everything of them, and looks around the room that has been, for 4 winters running, almost the entire world she inhabits. She could not have told you, that night, what was actually inside her walls. She could have told you, without a moment's hesitation, that both children in her care were warm, fed, and safe for one more night. And in the only way available to her, in the only way any of us can ever really promise safety to the people we love, she was right. The candle by her bed has burned down to its last inch. Outside, London sleeps under its usual low winter fog, unaware, as Agnes is unaware, of everything this story now knows. Somewhere beneath the green wallpaper, in the walls of a room built to be the safest, most beautiful place in the entire house, a woman who gave nearly everything she had to 2 children who were not her own has finally, for a few quiet hours, allowed herself to rest.